now that we find ourselves in a very, very hard place to be. It's very, very hard, particularly for the majority of our marginalized communities, which are the people that we actually should be thinking about in our emergency responses towards COVID-19. So our deepest concern as teaching workers from various spaces of teaching in post-school education, whether it is in universities, whether it is in our TVET colleges, whether it is within our communities, is the fact that the way in which the planning for education is happening, particularly the push towards online learning, is going to leave the majority of our students and our teaching workers behind. So we are very, very worried about that. And this is the context. The context of South Africa is that we come from a highly divisive history of apartheid, colonialism, which really fragmented our societies into places of various marginalizations, which resulted in inequality. Black bodies, we are talking about the bodies of women, we are talking about the bodies of poor people, we're talking about the bodies of sex workers who are currently criminalized within the system of South Africa. We are talking about migrants. As we speak, these are people, students in our institutions who actually come from other countries, who could not travel because of the restrictions and the regulations of COVID-19 to go back to what they know as home. They're internally displaced in most of our CBDs as we speak. They're hustling for shelter and place. So we're talking about that category of students. We're talking about some of our students who could be HIV positive as we speak. Their immune systems are already compromised, and many other chronic illnesses that our students are currently carrying within their bodies, which we need to pay attention to, because that compromised immune system is vulnerable to the transmission of COVID-19 infections. We're talking about the fact that the majority of Black communities are led largely by the working class of our communities, our mothers, our fathers, our workers. Workers at the moment who had to go back home. Some of them are precarious workers. They don't have income as we speak. Lockdown meant that most of them had to immediately lose incomes. So these are the realities that to speak about if you're saying we need to take into cognizance a move to online learning. And we're talking about the fact that the country as we speak has got the largest numbers of unemployment. How do we mitigate the fact that we are now expecting the unemployed parents, the unemployed members of our communities to take a role of teaching and learning? Because when you're saying, let us continue teaching in community, let us continue online in community, we are basically recognizing the fact that the modes of teaching and learning have changed. We are no longer teaching within our institutions, spaces that are largely spaces of privilege. We've moved into communities. COVID-19 has forced us back into our conditions of being. And these conditions necessitate that parents will have to play a particular role in teaching and learning. Neighbors would need to play a particular role. Grandmothers, grandfathers, and so on, particularly in the context of African families who are largely Black, poor, and living in informal settlements of our country. In the context of HIV, we have loads of child-headed families who, as we speak, none of us know how are they actually having food to eat. What do they do when they have to go to sleep at night without knowing where exactly is the next plate of food going to come from? A majority of our students were in residences where they had access to food, access to basic needs. COVID-19 necessitated that they had to immediately be stripped of that provision. So if you are saying we have to go and teach in communities, we have to think about where is that food going to come from? Food is a basic need. Food is a fundamental, basic human right. Everybody's body has got the right to eat. We cannot ignore that, particularly in the context of a virus that is so vicious and violent as COVID-19, where immune systems are already compromised. And if we are not committing ourselves as institutions of higher learning, post-education to thinking about that, then we lack a vision that sees these bodies as necessary bodies that will push us away from COVID-19. We need bodies that are well fed. We need bodies before they even open that computer, before they even open that telephone, before they even input that data. We need to first be sure that those bodies' immune systems are ready to fight back. So these are the issues that are fundamental to what we are calling teaching in community. Our sense is that our governments and our leaders of institutions are not paying attention to these conditions in the way that responses are being thought through. As much as an online learning is a nice thing to do, we feel that there's a step that we are missing. We need to go back to our communities and prepare. There's work that needs to be done. We need to go to the informal settlements and check, are our informal settlements ready to receive this online learning? We need to go back to our townships. We need to go back to our rural communities. As we speak, some of our students could not even go home because they just do not know where home is. They're hustling in the CBDs of our country as we speak. We don't even know what they eat before they go to bed tonight. And tomorrow we're going to wake up with gadgets, with laptops, with data, and say study and submit an assignment on the 30th of May. How in the world is that possible? How do you expect our students to study in the context of high levels of poverty, starvation, when they're subjected already to experiences of extreme destitution, extreme desperation? We are the parents. We have responsibility to take care of our students. So, Madam Chair, this is the context within which we find ourselves. And we can no longer afford to sit comfortable within these institutions and not address the plight of our students and our learners. Thanks.
Thank you. Just to say that was the Fikile Vilakazi from UKZN, speaking to the context in which this proposal is being made. So I'll call on the next person to speak, who is Natasha Valli from UCT, to speak to the core principles within which this proposal is being made.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to speak through the 4 guiding principles, but I think it's important that we be clear that these principles guide us not only with regards to the proposed plan that we've outlined and that we'll go on to outline in more detail today, but also the principles that guide the way we've been working together as the Post-School Education Alliance for Social Pedagogy. And I think that's important, that we're thinking of this as not being about only an outcome, but also about the way we move forward to think about social pedagogy and learning and thinking and teaching together. So the first of these 4 principles, again, it's important to note that while we've separated these principles for clarity, they necessarily intertwine and are informed by one another. So the first principle, inclusivity and participation. Like I said, all decisions about the form, the revised schedule of the academic project, as well as the support that's necessary, should be done in deep consultation, dialogue with the core constituencies. And I know Fikile has spoken about teaching workers, and we hold teaching workers to be inclusive. And we also would like to underline that these consultations and inclusivity include students, administrative workers, unions, parents, and communities. One of the fundamental failures of the steamrolling of what is called online education at the moment was that almost all of it was done with very little consultation. The second guiding principle is equity and equality. We assert that all students should be given an equal opportunity to participate in the learning processes. And until digital equity is achieved, there cannot be a rollout of learning processes. That means that digital equity needs to be addressed, and particular care needs to be given to resourcing those historically disadvantaged institutions. The third of the four principles is transformation and decolonization. So with this principle, we're saying that the methods, the means, and the content of academic engagement should play a transformative role in society. So we're not just teaching in order to pour information into students' heads, but we're teaching in a way that moves us forward towards a more just and equitable world, and towards a more just and equitable teaching and learning environment, while we further the process of decolonization, and also build on the expansive experiential learning of educational struggles for liberation in South Africa and globally. The fourth guiding principle is academic development and progress with integrity. So again, this needs to be inclusive. So it's the aims, the methods, the means, the content, and any assessment of academic engagement must equitably and sustainably hold and support all involved in post-school education. This needs to be done with compassionate values that promote contextually appropriate development through this, what we've called a portal period. These values are evident through reflective, rigorous, and systematic processes that support the experiential learning that we mentioned. So just to underline those principles at the end again, inclusivity and participation, equity and equality, transformation and decolonization, and academic development and progress with integrity.
Thank you, Natasha. Just to bring us to the purpose of the statement is that given this context, which has been outlined by Comrade Fikile and the principles outlined by Comrade Natasha, the Alliance proposes an approach which we're calling social pedagogy. And the ways in which it would apply, we offer guidance in terms of the key requirements in order for this to apply. And I call on Comrade Zabani Zikalala from a student at UKZN to speak to us, to take us through these key requirements. Tabani?
Yes, I'm a student at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. No, maybe I would like to take everyone through in terms of the key requirements, right? So we know, for example, that the many departments, your basic education and higher education, and many of the universities in South Africa are planning to forge ahead with trying to salvage the little they say is left of the academic calendar for the first semester. But in the context that Dr. Vilakazi has outlined, it then becomes a key requirement that we immediately cease all formal online curriculum rollout and any plans to go online in the immediate. And that is brought about the fact that there's been no concrete plan of how to make sure that there is no one who's left behind, and all students are able to immediately plug in and be able to participate equally like everyone else. Well, this also would require that the states, and in this regard, the Department of Higher Education, does not stay out of the process and let universities do things by themselves. There will need to be a very big state level provide the necessary resources and infrastructure to make sure that we are able to learn remotely where if the need is like that, and also be able to, when it is safe enough, to be able to return to universities. And of course, you need to allow a process where you are able to provide proper protection for students and the academic staff in the universities, to make sure that you are able to try and flatten the curve and to stop infections, because there seems to be an extreme on both sides, with the higher education and New South either saying we go online or we cancel the academic calendar, which does not make sense, because you have not dialogued, you have not immediately engaged all parties involved to make sure that to find common ground, and because also the resources to make sure that everyone is able to proceed with any form of learning that will be proposed have not been made, then you are leaving everyone who is less off, especially the working class of this country, very much behind. Because, for example, if there is no infrastructure and no resources being provided for the children in Katsina, for the children in Khayelitsha, the children in Wamashu, and the children in Engutu, Wanongoma, and many other of the far-flung areas, and there's no provision of resources for the many students who I know for a fact are left in CPTs of the country, because going home is not really an option. So how do you make sure that when you do proceed with the plan to recover the academic calendar, you do not leave all these people behind? So you need to approach, to be able, as the state in particular, to provide financial and accommodation protections for students, to make sure that students are able to have the necessary resources to plug in. But on the other side, you have academics who also need to be supported, well, first with PPE, to be able to say when they go in contact learning, they are able to be protected, but also for them themselves, because we have this big idea of who is the academic in South Africa. And unfortunately for many of us, we think of the academic as this affluent individual staying in a nice apartment in Mhlanga. We do not want to conceive of the academic living in a 4-roomed house in Wamashu with 10 other people. Because if we really conceive the academic that way, we'll then be able to understand that even for the academic to be able to provide online learning optimally, it's very difficult for someone who stays in Katomena, in Wamashu, in Khayelitsha, because we need to start thinking of students, of academics, and participants in the post-education space as representatives of the demographics of South Africa, because we seem to have this different idea of what the academic is in South Africa. One of the immediate requirements is to be able to conceptually understand the post-education sector in South Africa and who participates in it. Because if we continue to understand it the way we understand it now, then we are doomed for failure. We are doomed to leave majority of students outside. To make an example, the University of KwaZulu-Natal has plus or minus 62% of its students who are on NSFAS funding, but wants to go on an online process that requires that people have data, people have laptops, people have conducive environments, people have food, and every other thing. but majority of your students are working class and poor. So how do we make sure that these two are able to meet? And again, with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, with majority of its academic staff now black and working and from working class backgrounds, I can bet my money on that majority of those people are immigrants from outside of Durban. If they are staying in Durban or in KwaZulu-Natal, those people are from the townships. And even if they live in the so-called affluent areas, the social environment is not the same as someone who lives in a house where they live alone. So these are the requirements that the states must, in particular the states and universities in South Africa must be able to plug into. I hope I didn't take too much of the time, but at least it's to conceptually understand what do we require if we are going to be able to respond to the crisis in higher education as brought by the COVID-19. And also this to be noted, this is not to say that we do not care about the lives being lost because of COVID-19, but it is to say, in response to that, please consider the realities of what South Africa is, because South Africa is not a first world country. We are not America, nor are we Italy or another country. We are a third world country in a third world continent. So any response to the crisis must be guided by that, not be driven by a neoliberal thinking about education where it is every man for himself. We live in a continent where we can really not afford to leave anyone behind, because we are a country that is really in need of skills development and knowledge production. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabani. I think also just to highlight that one of the key requirements include an immediate cessation of formal online curriculum rollout. That's one of the key requirements right now, because the rollout is being done, and one of the elements of this proposal is that we stop that rollout immediately, because it is ineffective, and already because of the kinds of pressures it places students and educators and parents and families under. I call on Comrade Kheti Gama to take us through the next aspect of the proposal, which is the phases of the proposal. That the proposal offers a plan which is structured in phases, and that Comrade Kheti Gama will take us through those 3 phases.
So our proposed model that we have come up with in trying to actually move forward in terms of academics in South Africa with the pandemic that we currently have. It is in 3 phases. And it also takes into account all the social restrictions that we're currently undergoing, as well as also takes into account the resources that we have moving forward. The first phase that we have is a dialogue with students, teachers, as well as communities to collaboratively map the context and to appropriately adapt curricula and develop pedagogic strategies to the delivering of a socially just program. The second phase that we have is roll out a supportive, structured, but flexible learning process that employs, firstly, subject-specific knowledge, drawing on existing curricula. Secondly, adapted teaching materials that engage with the material and social effects of the current crisis. Thirdly, a formative assessment. And then the last phase that you have is a return to campus-based teaching where deemed safe, feed the material and experience of phases 1 and 2 into formal curricula, continue with formal assessments, and restructure formal assessment for fairness and academic integrity. And just to add on to the phases that we have, and also looking into account with the plan that is currently being rolled out in South Africa, there was very little, if any, consultation that was done with teachers, students, as well as societies in actually involving them in the plans moving forward for the academic year. Secondly, the rollout plan does not actually seem to support the disadvantaged learners as well as disadvantaged schools that we currently have in South Africa. For example, in TVET colleges, majority of our students, just like Tobani Zikalala had actually mentioned, are dependent on NSFAS. How will they be able to move around from their respective homes back to their respective colleges? Also, the current structures that we have in colleges and what is expected from the document that we have seen, or the rollout plan that we have seen, does not actually accommodate majority of the infrastructure that we have in our TVET colleges. And then lastly, in terms of returning to campus-based teaching, what had been mentioned and what we had discussed, especially with TVET colleges, was that government had given us a plan that our learning will actually be separated, whereby our classrooms will be separated into 2 groups. So you probably have a class of about 40 learners, and you're supposed to separate those 40 learners into about 2 groups of 20. We firstly don't have infrastructure to accommodate the 40 learners in the first place. So once we actually have to separate them into 20 classes, into 2 groups of 20 classes, that means more infrastructure is required for our learners. Where's that infrastructure going to come from at this point in time? So we're battling that, only that, but we're also battling with we're also battling with students who do not currently have access to any form of online learning facilities, whether it be data, whether it the internet. We have learners from remote areas such as Bergville that would need to travel for 30 minutes to an hour before they can actually access an internet cafe. And at this point in time, an internet cafe is actually closed. Where are they going to access that from? There was also a suggestion that our learners need to actually go onto Facebook, whereby we'll be giving lessons on Facebook, but half the time the learners that we actually have don't even have a smartphone. We find that our learners are raised by grandmothers who are earning pensions and by mothers that are reliant on social grants. If we are expecting our learners to actually go online, where is that money going to come from in the first place? So I think those things were not actually looked into properly when the current rollout plan was devised by government. So it would be very unfortunate if we were to go ahead and actually implement that, because we're leaving a majority of our students behind, especially with TVET colleges, whereby 90% of our students are from rural areas. 90% of our students are from disadvantaged communities. So if we are rolling out a plan that is only going to benefit those that are already more privileged, what are we saying about the ones that aren't? Are we saying they're not better off in getting an education? Why are we leaving them behind? So that is the proposed plan that we have, our 3-place plan for the year, and yeah, hopefully it will be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Khitsi, for taking us through those 3 phases. And if people were to look at the document in more detail, the 3 phases right now are structured in 2 months each. 2 months for the first and 2 months for the second phase. That the first is primarily about prep, the second is about rollout, and the third is about coming back to campuses and how we'd work there. So I call now on Jane Quinn of UKZN to take us through the ideas of social pedagogy, which are central to the plan and the thinking behind the plan. Jane?
Unmuted? Right. Thanks. Yeah, this term social pedagogy was very carefully selected because we wanted to follow the principles that we were talking about in terms of being inclusive and participatory. So we used this term as the broadest possible way of keeping us going in a direction that articulates our principles, but is inclusive to as many people as possible. So the broad tone and approach we have captured in the summative statement in the preamble to our original document, that, as Natasha said, recognizes the portal moment, and that we need to be addressing overlapping global crises of socioeconomic inequalities, climate catastrophe, and the coronavirus pandemic. So the way in which we proceed needs to promote a just recovery in the interests of all. And it has to be grounded then on the values of equity, Ubuntu, human dignity, compassion, respect for human life, nature, and environment. So we have put forward we've proposed social pedagogy as a way in which we can craft a contextually appropriate and compassionate way forward. So the document does define social pedagogy in a particular way, and I'll go on to that now. But I just want to look a little bit more at what the term means and why we selected it. Because social literally means people, and pedagogy is ways of learning and teaching. I think a very useful aspect to notice in terms of social pedagogy is that a key term is with. It is about relationship between these elements of learning, teaching, and people. So that's the basis on which we define social pedagogy for this pandemic as one that promotes inclusive participation, equality and justice, and prioritizes people within the environment. And you'll hear how much we are talking about the relations that need to be primary. So the pedagogy employed must enable students to be active citizens and engage in a socially responsive way. So this requires us all to adjust our teaching based on unfolding experiences within the context of a pandemic, in a manner that links teaching with learning, with communities within the global context. It entails building on the education for liberation trajectories of people's education, of people's equal education, and the free education conceptualizations that were generated in the Fees Must Fall momentum. Preparation for this pedagogy will involve a program of dialogue, resourcing and development, engaging teachers with learners and our respective social, economic, and political environments, as well as state and institutional partners. This consultative process allows teachers and learners to continuously develop and review methods as the process unfolds. Assessment prior to returning to campus or school-based teaching can only be formative for the purpose of contributing to the program of a just recovery. And then further formative and summative assessment can occur once we have full contact in order to ensure academic integrity and fair progression. I think that's possibly all we need to say right now on social pedagogy, unless there are more questions about it. I think actually the one thing that I would just like to add to this is that the social pedagogy is traditionally about theory with practice. So the one informs the other. And how we work out social pedagogy in practice, going forward from where we are here now, requires us to recognize that relationship between theory with practice explicitly and critically and centrally. It means we must acknowledge who brings what to the learning and teaching relationship in this dynamic, unknown period of the pandemic. Typically, teachers have knowledge and skills for sharing that with their learners, for sharing their knowledge with their learners in known contexts of relationship with the means available. In the present case of the corona pandemic, only the learners in their specific spaces know that context. All knowledge development and progress now requires that teachers and learners discover together what those spaces are and mean in order for learning to take place in a way that works for the learner, teacher, and society, and in respect of the specific learning field they are engaged in together. If we take this approach, every person who is currently teaching hopefully can begin to see how they work with their learners within the contextual space they are now in order to unfold and discover together just, equitable, and compassionate ways forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. I think we've covered all the various bases, unless some people have questions that they might want to ask here. I know there are some people here that haven't been part of the discussions before, so this would be an appropriate point to raise questions. If you can raise your hands in the box on the side, and I can note you. Okay. Perhaps just a quick summary then before we close up, that in terms of the proposal that's being put forward, there is a plan which is couched in the context of a social pedagogy, which primarily would require that we immediately stop the rollout of online teaching, that we make the state significantly responsible in resourcing the future interventions and infrastructure development, and ensuring the protection of students as we move along. And for that, there is an offer of a 3-phase process, in 2 months for dialogue with students, 2 months for a rollout, and then followed by a period of returning to campus for teaching when we can. I think that concludes it. If anybody else wants to say anything else, add anything else?
Yes, can I, if I
Yes.
may come in? Thank you so much. I think it's important to say that we are willing to work with our institutions to support a process that gets us into that place, because we are also aware that this is all new to us, and we're all really trying very hard, whether it's our DVCs, whether it's our heads of schools, whether it's us as academics and administrators, trying to find solutions. So we're not just proposing this from a place of saying, but we're also willing to be part of this process. So we are really appealing and calling on the various institutions to know that we are available to talk to us, and which is why this moment of dialogue that we are calling upon is not just about talking, but we have ideas in our heads in terms of how this can happen, and we are willing to go to the depths of it to ensure that it is practicalized. So we are the capacity, and we are here, we are available anytime. We're just really waiting for them to say, let us start, and we can begin.
Thank you for that, Fikile. Anybody else like to say something before we conclude? I think that was perfect, to say that what we're offering here is a proposal and an opening to talk, to be in communication, to offer the expertise that we have, so that we use what we call a portal moment, not to return to the way things were, but to move to a different new and a different now through this moment, and that we not lose the opportunity of this moment that is currently here in order to shift and start thinking differently and doing differently. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fikile, can I return the host? Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Can I return the host to you?
Yes, you can, Fatima.
So that you can save this recording.
I think it is likely to also go to you, so we'll just double check with each other.
Okay.
Can I just add one thing there quickly? Just, I know we're sort of at the casual end of it, but just to add on to what you're saying, Fikile, for me, one of the ways of that we need to think differently through the social pedagogy lens about learning and teaching is this thing that we've brought up again and again about participation and consultation. And we're really talking about the learning and teaching relationship. The learners and the teachers are the primary people. They are the closest people in that relationship. And in order for us to then actualize, realize social pedagogy, it is that relationship that needs to be foregrounded. I think is very important for leadership within higher education, post-school education at the moment, to recognize that if we can start on the basis of the closest proximity to the teaching and learning relationship and work from there outward in the consultation process. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane, for saying that. I think if I may come through you, Chair.
Sure, I'm done sharing, guys.
Thank you so much. So for me, I think that conversation is very, very key, but I really also want to emphasize the social elements, particularly for those of us who are coming from, disciplines of humanities, social sciences, it becomes even more essential because our very form of our disciplines are located within deeply embedded social processes, both at the level of our praxis, but also at the level of our theories. And this is so we can't not be a part of teaching in community because of the COVID-19 crisis. And in fact, it presents opportunities for us to reimagine theoretically ways of creating knowledge through this process, knowledge that is contextualized to inform theory as well, particularly at a time when we are calling for decolonization of our curriculum. This is it. We are making the knowledge. This is the knowledge. The knowledge is sitting within our communities. And we are building on a culture, intellectual culture that was really, set up since 2015 by bodies of our students, brilliantly so, who were completely enraged about the situation of inequalities within our institutions in terms of access and funding. So we have that intellectual capital, in the bodies of our students. And what this opportunity presents for us is to be able to channel the rage that is sitting within the bodies of our students, rightfully so, into places of excellence within our communities. Already, we have most of our students in communities feeding the hungry, helping the sick, taking care of grandmothers, and in that way, rebuilding the foundations of our society that were eroded massively by institutions of capital domination, slavery, colonization, and apartheid. So we are reorganizing. So this is really an opportunity that the rage of our students translates itself into reorganizing our communities. But in the meantime, post-COVID-19,
Maybe Owento can mute himself because that is interfering here. We can't hear Figile, please. Thank you. Sorry, Figile, we lost you for a bit.
Not a problem. So what I was saying, comrades and colleagues, is that when we do that, our students are very clear. They're very, very clear, and I think they've made us aware through the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign and the Roads Must Fall campaign that they are ready to lead this country. They are ready to reorganize. Although some of us chose to condemn the violence that has occurred, and I think we continue to do that. What we have missed in that opportunity is our responsibility as parents and as teachers, as teaching workers, to channel that rage into places of excellence. So what COVID-19 has done for us, it presents us with these bodies of intellect, which are bodies that have been sitting within our institutions, who are now internally displaced within communities, to say, can we use that intellect? Because the analysis that came out from there, particularly if we are really committed to decolonization of our curriculum and to ending all forms of violences that sit within our episteme at the moment, theoretically speaking, where we're still very much borrowing from scholarships of the West, scholarships that emerged post-1945, which are really largely geared towards neoliberalism and fragmenting our societies. So we have these bodies. Through that hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign, we have said we do not want to be fed this episteme. This is epistemic violence. We are knowledge creators. We know our communities. We know where our grandmothers and our grandfathers come from in terms of the history. And we recognize the fact that there were mistakes that were made. And I think in our scholarship, Comrade Fanon reminds us of those mistakes, right? That there was a time and a moment like this presented itself where, our intellectuals of the time, like Abu Kwame Nkrumah and so on, had to make decisive decisions of this kind that we are faced with because of COVID-19. And what I'm saying is that let us not repeat the mistakes of the past. Let us re-invoke Comrade Fanon and listen and hear to what he's saying to us in this moment. And I'm hearing him saying to us, we have a responsibility to use the intellectual bodies of our students as capital, as human capital that can go into communities and be able to channel that rage, which is necessary because we have to be enraged by the violences of the past to reorganize ourselves. And the anticipation is that post-COVID-19, we will really emerge with stronger infrastructure, stronger communities, collective bonds of bodies who would remember what it means to be family, what it means to be neighbors, what it means to take care of each other. And for me, that is fundamentally located within our African ways of being. So it means that we are decolonizing in ways that we are becoming conscious of what we mean by African Renaissance. And it means that then we don't need to rely on theories of modernization, for instance, because we are beginning to make sense of what COVID-19 means for us in terms of episteme. So we're moving more towards a world where we are freeing ourselves, we are liberating ourselves. COVID-19 is an opportunity of liberation. It is a revolution that is taking us towards a world that is possible without these epistemic violences, social violences, and our infrastructure and our social fabric will be reorganized. And these bodies are willing. The bodies of our young people are willing, both in terms of intellect and presence, and power and vision. So that's what I wanted to add.
I think that's really valuable, and you've captured it very nicely toward the end. I think it's a great way to conclude. Thank you so much. Is there anybody else who wants to contribute? Or can we close? Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks. The work keeps happening, and so stay connected. If you're not already on the WhatsApp group, you can become a part of it, so let us know, and let the other people know who are here, and people can add you to become part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Fatima.
Thank you.